Birds, hamsters, and other creatures are kept in cages so they can't escape. Criminals are locked in jail because they are a danger to society. Sick people are quarantined so they don't spread their illness. The Japanese Americans, on the other hand, were relocated to internment camps because Americans were merely afraid of them. It was a bad time for Japanese Americans after Pearl Harbor in 1941, and the treatment they received was unjustified. The internment was both unconstitutional and inhumane. It violated 2 amendments and it caused innocent Japanese Americans to suffer in multiple ways, even though the Japanese Americans proved their loyalty to America. As a result of Pearl Harbor, America joined the war against Japan, and President Franklin Roosevelt passed Executive Code 9066. This order stated that 120,000 Japanese Americans or any people of Japanese descent would be relocated to internment camps. The camps were in remote western areas because Americans were worried that Japanese Americans would betray America and help Japan invade the West Coast, where most Japanese Americans lived. The Japanese internment was motivated by racial prejudices, wartime hysteria, and pressure from American and government officials. Many Americans were jealous of the Japanese Americans because their crops and farm businesses profited more than the white farmers' businesses. Also, people became paranoid after America joined the war. Americans were worried they would endure the same torture as China did when it was invaded by the Japanese, and World War I was still memorable. Because of the paranoia, government officials and Americans pressured President Roosevelt to isolate and imprison the Japanese Americans to keep them from potentially harming America. The internment camps were the American version of German concentration camps. People were being penalized because of their race. Half the people in the camps were children, and the conditions were not at all hospitable. In short, people died due to inadequate housing, lack of food, and lack of medical care. The Supreme Court's job is to ensure that the Constitution is being followed. However, that didn't happen with Japanese internment. First, the 14th Amendment expresses that every person born in the U.S. is a citizen. This meant that most Japanese Americans were legally American citizens. Being an American citizen includes getting equal protection and having their constitutional rights. Furthermore, the 5th Amendment grants any U.S. citizen or person living in the U.S. boundaries the right to due process. Japanese Americans were indeed American citizens, yet they were being relocated to concentration camps because people saw them as a threat. There was no legal process of any sort, solely a paper flyer with instructions regarding the relocation. Japanese internment not only affected Japanese Americans during the relocation, but also before and after. They rushed to sell their businesses, homes, stores, and belongings because they were given such short notice regarding when and where to relocate. As a result, everything was sold at a fraction of its true value. For example, a 22-room hotel was sold for $300, and its true value was $6,000. A handcrafted piano was sold for a mere $5. The belongings they left behind were stolen when they returned from the camps, and there was no way to recover all the money they lost. Once at the camps, they were faced with small portions of food, overcrowding, and unbearable temperatures. Each camp was fenced with a barbed wire and had armed guards. There was one mess hall, one recreational hall, and a row of bathrooms that 250 to 300 Japanese Americans had to share. The rooms were simple with cots and a stove. 4 years later, they were finally released. The Japanese Americans should have rejoiced, but they had nothing to return to. It is estimated that the Japanese Americans lost a total of $400 million in land. The Japanese Americans proved their loyalty to the Americans, even though, as citizens, it shouldn't have been necessary. While in turn, they continued to help America. The ones that spoke Japanese were taken from the camps and trained to read and write fluently. They were then used as translators during the war. In the Philippines, captured Japanese documents were translated by them and ended up saving many American lives. They also fought against Japan in hand-to-hand combat in Burma and China. The 442nd Regiment Combat Team was composed of all Japanese Americans, and they fought valiantly for America. 9,486 Japanese Americans were wounded or died. This regiment had the highest casualty rate and was the most decorated American unit in the war. They received 7 Presidential Unit citations, 52 Distinguished Service Crosses, and 560 Silver Stars. Yet Americans continued to keep Japanese Americans interned. Even the most patriotic actions, like sacrificing your life in war to save your country, were not sufficient. In the end, Japanese Americans were wrongfully put in internment camps for 4 years. It didn't matter that most Japanese Americans had never been to Japan, couldn't speak, read, or write Japanese. It didn't matter if they were World War I veterans, or even if they were born in the U.S. Japanese Americans should have never occurred in the first place because it was unconstitutional. The Japanese Americans acted as a scapegoat for the Americans to feel safe. 50 years later, the U.S. gave each victim $200,000 in reparations and a signed apology from the president. Nothing can repay the Japanese Americans for losing 4 years of their life, for death of loved ones, for losing all possessions and money, and for losing respect from their own country. To this day, there is no proof that a single Japanese American helped Japan in World War II.